I think the most important aspect of the vetting process was time. So the reason I say that is that I contacted the tribe in July of 2017, but the tribe didn't invite me to come to Standing Rock Reservation until April of 2018. And it took a while for them to get to know me and perhaps build that sense of trust. But then something else happened, which, as you probably know, the tribe administration changed hands in late 2017, and Chairman Mike Faith was elected into office then. And because of that, I think we began in some ways anew with that process of trust and getting to know one another as we went through. One, they knew that they weren't my research subjects, what's often called subjects or participants. That typically suggests kind of a hierarchy that just didn't exist in this research. And so they knew that they were my partners and that they were my collaborators. The tribe also knew that I didn't speak for them, but they were trusting me to represent their thoughts and their perspectives. And finally, a crucial aspect of this research protocol was that they knew that they would read everything that I'd written before it went to the publisher. And I gave ample time for that. If there was a way in which they felt that they were being misrepresented, or perhaps the events at Standing Rock were misrepresented, they knew that I would take that out without question. And that was a big part of that protocol. If I may add as well, in the effort to avoid colonizing research, I think that it happens in a few different ways. Sometimes it's, I hate to say intentional, but sometimes it happens where it's called helicopter research, where there's a researcher who comes in, drops into a space, gets all the information that they want, and then leaves that community and never comes back and never communicates again. But I think it can also happen unintentionally. And because of that, I was very careful to have others read my work. So Dr. Danica Starud Miller, who is assistant professor in American Indian Studies, she offered to discuss my research protocol with me prior to my going out to Standing Rock. Then she kindly and generously also offered to read the book and provide a review. And I also had other Indigenous writers who I really admire and respect read and review the book as well. And so I think in that sense, I was as cautious, I think, as I could have been in that respect in working out the research protocol. A researcher can't be on a quick time frame in terms when one is working really with any groups, but I would say also with Indigenous communities. It can't be a very quick one and done sort of process. And so making sure that there's space and time to do this research. I think also being open to sharing things about yourself. So I was very open about what I thought maybe my strengths were, but as well as my limitations. I will say this, the tribe was very generous and patient with me in terms of what I didn't know. And so we would talk about those things. Our interview when I went to Standing Rock was supposed to be, I think it was 3 hours, but I ended up being there about 6 hours. And I think it's because they trusted me enough to talk to me, and the conversation went where it was going to go. So honestly, I think it's time. I think making sure time and openness. I will add this, however, is that I would say that if I do any work like this in the future, that I would try even harder to co-author and to partner even more with the Indigenous communities that I study. At that time, they indicated to me that what they wanted was to do the interviews, and I respected their degree of involvement. I asked the same of Mark Trahant, and at the time he was working 3 jobs, including being a professor of communications. And so the timing wasn't quite right for that. But I think that if I did work in the future, I would make more time and I would attempt to co-author even more. Media framing, I'll start by saying that we all have frames. It may be that we have a political frame, a progressive frame, or a conservative frame, and that impacts how individuals approach certain issues. The media are no different. They also have frames. And what it means is that all media outlets perhaps will cover an issue, a big issue, like a politician or something, big event. But the way in which they cover it will be different, and that's called framing. And so frames tend to invite certain perceptions of an issue that I think are really powerful. When it came to Standing Rock, so I had looked at big national newspapers in Canada and the US, and then I also looked at regional newspapers located in oil-producing regions in Canada and the US. And what I found was that while the big national newspapers really tended to cover the issue largely through the lens of, or the frame of, environmental and social justice, it was really the smaller newspapers that were located in oil-producing regions that had almost the opposite type of coverage. And what I mean by that is there were two main frames that emerged from that coverage, and one was economic and the other was law and order. Now, those frames are this. The way that smaller newspapers like the Bismarck Tribune covered the pipeline through the lens of economic was, this is how much money we're going to be making if this pipeline goes through. And so there was this kind of sense of, we need to have this pipeline go through to make money. The flip side of the economic frame was that if we don't have this pipeline, we are going to lose money. And that was really important. And the reason why was that the second major frame that the Bismarck Tribune had was law and order. This was perhaps the most troubling frame, because the law and order frame tended to portray the water protectors and their supporters as though they were violent lawbreakers, unpredictable, had to be controlled and contained. And you put those two together, and the smaller newspapers' framing really was, you could sort of sum it up as, we need this pipeline for economic gain. We can't let anything stand in our way of making this money. And the water protectors and their supporters are law-breaking criminals, and we need to crack down. Those two frames really went hand in hand and were pretty troubling. In terms of framing of what's happening maybe in now, I know that on top of Mauna Kea in Hawaii, there are thousands of Native Hawaiians and their supporters who are blocking the road leading up to the construction of this huge telescope. It would be one of the largest in the world. And what I've noticed, not just in one newspaper, but in multiple, is that the framing really is two things. There's a framing of this telescope as progress, science. We're going to be able to see, I think the telescope promises that it will allow one to see back to the Big Bang. So there's this huge promise there. And so the news media frame this promise as progress and science and enlightenment. But the second part of the framing that I've seen thus far, and this has been in newspapers in the UK as well as in the US, like NBC, they then frame the Native Hawaiian beliefs as being really subjective and as standing in the way of constructing this telescope and getting to progress. So framing in this case is a really subtle denigration of Native beliefs, in this case about sacred Mauna Kea. I'll say this, I teach media for a living, and even I get taken in by the news from time to time. A few months ago, I actually believed a news article about plastic in the oceans and how it all been solved, and that scientists could then change plastic into water. So I was so excited, but of course it was fake news. So how do we approach the news given this framing? One, I always recommend triangulation. I think most of us do that now anyway. And what I mean by that is, it's not just one source that you look at, it's multiple sources. It's easier in the age of the internet because we have multiple sources at our fingertips just through a quick search of, say, Google News. But if we can also make ourselves aware of the news media frames, then I think we will always be critical, at least hopefully when we need to be. Having said that, in the news media, balance turns out to be, I think, really harmful. And the reason I say that is, I'll give two examples, and one is Standing Rock, but the first is climate change. The news media have been covering climate change since the 1960s. But the way in which the news media covered climate change is it was always one scientist believed that it was real and human caused, and another scientist then believed that it wasn't real and that we shouldn't worry about our impact on the Earth. The problem is that about almost 98% of scientists believe that climate change is real, it's here, and it's human caused. Only 2% or so of scientists believe that it's not. But the way that the news media present balance, that is to say both sides, makes it look like the issue is 50-50. And I would sort of posit that that's the reason why we took so long to address climate change and understand that it was real, because the news media always presented the issue as being balanced. Talking about Standing Rock, I think one of the biggest issues that came up in my research, because of course I was looking at framing, was that the news media, especially the Bismarck Tribune, so located right at the center of everything that was happening, that the Bismarck Tribune tried to be balanced as well, and the same issues come up. And here's what I mean. There were reports that came out during the height of the resistance to the pipeline. And those reports said that concussion grenades were being used against water protectors, that water cannon were being used, and other militarized means of force. When it came to some of those things, like concussion grenades, one protester, Sophie Wilansky, said, well, it almost took off my arm, you used it. The Morton County Sheriff said, no, we didn't. When the Bismarck Tribune reports on an issue like this, and others, it tends to report on he said, she said, what they call that sort of sense. But the primary function of the news is to tell the truth, is to find out what actually happened. This was really unusual because the Bismarck Tribune was right there. It was right at the center of what was happening. It could well have done that investigative research to learn what it was happening. But instead, if they pull back and just say he said, she said, I don't think that the public is any more informed. And so I'm always careful when it comes to balance, because when it comes to social justice issues, I think that if there is sort of balance, or if the balance is asymmetrical, that it should actually lean towards social justice. I think that, so when I was doing this research, I was focused on what we call old media, legacy media. So New York Times, CNN, MSNBC, things like that. And in there, as you may well know, there just aren't that many Indigenous journalists. And so I think that if my research had included other outlets, I think we would have seen more. I did look at Indian Country Media Network is what it was called then. I know it's changed names now, but I did actually look at Indigenous journalists covering the issues, and what I found was they had a frame of environmental justice the entire time. And not only that, the Indigenous journalists writing for that outlet, they also provided something that the other outlets did not: context. They provided history, everything that one would need to sort of understand the issue with a little bit more, I think, nuance. And so I found that. But yes, the bulk of what I looked at, in fact, almost all of the mainstream news outlets that I looked at were all covered by non-native people. So that's a good question about the name, because I did not get the title that I wanted. So the title is Journalism, Politics, and the Dakota Access Pipeline, Standing Rock in the Framing of Injustice. It is available through the publisher, which is Routledge, but it's also available on Amazon. I will tell you that a few months ago, when the news media covered the Native Hawaiian elders being arrested as they blocked traffic going up to the top of Mauna Kea, it brought something up in me. And so I began to be very interested in what was happening there. I do have Native Hawaiian friends there. And it is true that I asked them if they would talk to some of the organizers and see if I could come out and do interviews. Having said that, this time I think I will make sure that there is a co-author who is Native Hawaiian. And so if the research happens, first and foremost, I will have the permission and the blessing of Native Hawaiian organizers of that movement. And then I would try to co-author as well. So if that comes down the pike, I would be very pleased to do that research, because I think that the way that the media covers these issues is a story that needs to be told, because they need to be oriented more towards social justice.